Modern India. The history of our country can safely be divided into ancient, medieval, and modern periods. The ancient period started long, long ago, as long as human beings have lived on this earth. During the last two periods, you must have already read about the society, economy, polity, and culture, and you must have found that it was very different from each other. These differences, which you may also call progress, developed, continued, and increased at a very fast pace and had very much more deeper impact on our lives. You may also recall that all those who came to India from outside, such as the Turks, the Afghans, and the Mughals, made India their home. But the British colonial rulers always remained foreigners to this land. Nonetheless, they brought profound social, economic, and political changes to suit their interests, and in the process, they also left deep imprints on many aspects of our Indian culture. If you see the Rashtrapati Bhavan in New Delhi, you can have a clear picture of the British impact on Indian architecture. You see the pattern repeated in many buildings in Kolkata, Mumbai, and in several other parts of the country. All these have now become a part of our cultural heritage. Apart from these architectural remains, the colonial state also left behind a uniform system of government, a system of education based on Western ideas, science, and philosophies. It would be very interesting for you to know that the social and religious reform movements begun in the 19th century helped to build a modern India as well. Modern literature and Indian languages were also deeply influenced by the spread of English education, and through it India's intimate contact with the ideas and institutions of the West. From 1450 onwards, three important developments had taken place which changed the shape of Europe. It was the invention of the printing press, the beginning and the spread of the Renaissance and the Reformation movement, and finally the discovery of new trade routes. Thereafter, Europe made great progress in the fields of science, exploration, and gunnery. Soon, their armies and navies became the best in the world. Scientific education began to spread. Logic and reason became the touchstone on which the old dogmas and learning were tested. Among these European countries, the Portuguese, and then the Dutch, the French, and finally the British entered into a race to control the trade from India. The British ultimately succeeded in not only controlling trade but also the country, and for about 2 centuries India remained under her domination, where her entire human resources were recklessly exploited and her wealth was drained away for the benefit of the ruling nation. To further their interest, the British used the prevailing social and political situations in India. Also, here a large number of states had cropped up after the decline of the Mughal Empire. The British took advantage of this situation and had one ruler fight against the other or supported a usurper to the throne. Though Tipu Sultan of Mysore tried to use the same principle as used by the British, that is, making use of the rivalry between the French and the British, he could not match the superior diplomacy and firepower of the British. The British domination of India was built upon successive phases. The first phase consisted of taking hold of the Indian trade. They brought Indian goods at very low prices and sold them in the Western market at very high prices, thereby making enormous profits without even giving anything to the peasants. In this, they were helped by the Indians, of course. Seths and Gumastas were such examples. In the second phase, the British took control of the production activities in a manner that would suit their export objectives. In the process, they successfully destroyed the Indian industries. This was because India was a potential buyer of their goods. The third phase was an intensified phase of British imperialism and colonial exploitation, when India was ruled by the British for fulfilling British economic interests. The Britishers came to India for making profits through trade. Soon, they gained political and economic control of the country. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757 AD, they had become the real masters of Bengal. They used political control over Bengal to increase their trade and export of foreign goods. They eliminated the Indian as well as foreign rivals in trade so that there could be no competition. They monopolized the sale of raw cotton and made Bengal weavers pay exorbitant prices. They imposed heavy duties on Indian goods entering Britain so as to protect their own industry. With the coming of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, the Indian industries were hit very hard. By 1813, the Indian handicrafts lost both the domestic as well as the foreign market. Indian goods could not compete with the British factory made products where machines were in use. On the other hand, the English merchants had accumulated a lot of wealth which they now invested in setting up industries and trade. The East India Company helped in financing and expanding their industrial base. During this time, there was a class of manufacturers in England who benefited more from manufacturing than trading. They were interested in having more raw materials from India as well as sending their finished goods back. Between 1793 and 1830, these British manufacturers launched a campaign against the company, its trade monopoly and the privileges it enjoyed. Ultimately, in 1813, they succeeded in abolishing the East India Company's monopoly of Indian trade. With this, India became an economic colony of industrial England. As a result, Indian handmade goods faced extinction as British machine made goods were cheaper. These goods either had a free entry or paid very low tariff rates to enter India. Indians were to be modernized so that they could develop taste for Western goods and buy them. The Indian industry suffered as a result of exploitation at the hands of the British, who did not care at all about Indian trade interests. They did not protect Indian trade, nor did they introduce any advanced technology in the country during this period. Indian handicrafts suffered when foreign goods were given free entry. On the other hand, Indian handicrafts were taxed heavily when they entered Britain. Indian sugar mills paid duty 3 times its original price when sent to Britain. So the trade from India virtually came to a stop. India had become an excellent consumer of British goods and a rich supplier of raw materials by the year 1813 AD. Since England wanted to exploit India for commercial gains, that is, by buying raw materials and selling finished goods, they introduced steamships and railways in India. The railways opened a vast market to the British and facilitated export of Indian raw material abroad. Do you know that it was in 1853 that the first railway line running from Bombay to Thane was opened to public? The railways connected the raw material producing areas with the exporting ports. As a result, British goods flooded the Indian market. Do you know that the railways played an important role in the national awakening of the country also? They helped to bring people and ideas closer, something that the British had never anticipated. Isn't this ironical? Do you know Dalhousie opened the first telegraph line from Calcutta to Agra and also introduced the postal service in India? India in the 18th century was a picture of many contrasts and contradictions. Economically, agriculture was the main occupation of the people. Since the rulers were constantly at war, they did not have the time to improve agricultural conditions of the land. Finally, foreign trade was flourishing under the Mughals. India imported pearls, raw silk, wool, dates, dried fruits from the Persian Gulf region, coffee, gold, drugs and honey from Arabia, tea, porcelain and silk came into India from China. Luxury goods were also brought in from Tibet, Singapore, Indonesian islands, Africa and Europe. India exported raw silk, silk fabrics, indigo, sugar, pepper and many other things. India's cotton textiles were famous all over the world. In spite of such a favorable balance of trade, India's economic condition could not improve because of constant warfare. Within the country, there were revolts of the Sikhs, the Jats, the Marathas, and from outside, foreign invasions like that of Nadir Shah in 1739 AD and Ahmad Shah Abdali 1761 were common. By the 18th century, European countries like France, England, Portugal, and Spain were interested in trading with India. They helped in creating more political and economic instability in the country, and ultimately they destroyed its economy. But by this time, India's fame had spread all over the world as a land of beautiful handicrafts. Socially, there was no unity of pattern in the social and cultural life of the people. Whether they were Hindus or Muslims, there was division among them on the basis of region, tribe, language, and caste. Caste rules were to be observed in matters of marriage, diet, interdining, as well as in choosing a profession. Anyone found disobeying rules was most likely to be thrown out of the community. In the field of science, India was so advanced, had by now neglected her mathematics and sciences. They remained ignorant of the advances made in the field of science by the West. Teachers were respected in society during those times. Education was steeped in tradition. The students were taught reading and writing along with arithmetic. Girls seldom went to school. Education was not patronized by the state, but by local rulers, members of the aristocracy, and benevolent contributors. Friendly relations existed between the people of the two religions, that is, Hindu and Muslims. Religious toleration was practiced. The wars were political and fought for selfish reasons rather than for religion. Members of both the communities participated in each other's festivals. Many Hindus had faith in Muslim saints, while many Muslims showed an equal respect for Hindu gods and saints. In fact, the upper class Hindus and Muslims had many more things in common with each other than with the lower classes of their own community. Besides, the Muslims had adopted the Indian style and culture so well that it was difficult to distinguish one from the other. India finally became independent from the British rule in 1947. Independent India can rightly be proud of her achievements too. One of the most important achievements of post-independent India is the laying of a sound foundation for a secular and democratic republic. The parliamentary system of government adopted since independence had stood the test of time, and India today is the largest parliamentary democracy in the world. Integration of the erstwhile princely states into the Indian Union is another major achievement of our country. The reorganization of the states is still an ongoing process, and new states and union territories are being formed as per needs and desire of the people. Economic planning has been introduced after independence to ensure the country's economic growth with social justice. As a result, India has made considerable progress in the sphere of economic development, particularly in the field of agriculture and agro-based industries. India has also made commendable progress in the fields of science and technology. In the high technology areas also, she is fast catching up with the highly developed countries. India's voice is now heard with respect in international meetings because of her political and economic stability and diplomatic stature in the region. The issue of India becoming a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council is similarly gaining wide acceptance today. The nationalist movement was an important feature of modern India. British imperialist colonialism was the chief cause of India's backwardness in every sphere. Indians were now coming to realize this truth. The peasants and the workers were the worst victims of British greed and apathy. The industrialists and the capitalists were also not satisfied with their British rule. The intelligentsia at this time played a significant role. Their initial hope that the British would be benevolent rulers was shattered. Now they could see that the British were greedy and selfish, guided by sheer personal self-interest and that of Britain in general. By the 19th century, all Indians were united in that they had all realized they had a common enemy, the Britishers, who were out to destroy India for their own benefit. The Britishers did help in bringing about administrative and economic unification of the country. They introduced the communication system of railways, telegraphs and post, as well as developed roads and motor transport, which contributed to this unification. Western thought and education that came to India with the British helped in arousing the consciousness of the Indian people. Modern ideas of democracy, humanism, nationalism and sovereignty of the people started guiding Indians towards nationalism. The press and literature played an equally important role in spreading nationalistic feelings. There were many patriotic writers who inspired the people with their writings. During the 19th century also came a revival of the ancient glory of India. It was spearheaded by some enlightened Europeans who studied India's past and brought out its depth and glory. Some eminent educated Indians also contributed in this revival by spreading the awareness of it in the country. The racial arrogance and discrimination on the part of the British rulers in India, the agitation of the Britishers against the Ilbert Bill, Lord Lytton's anti-India measures and the holding of the lavish British King's Darbar in India, when many Indians were dying due to famines, all led to the intensification of anti-British feelings among Indians. All these became the reasons for the spread of nationalistic feelings in the country during the 19th century. These feelings took the form of a nationalistic movement with the advent of the Indian National Congress started by Alexander Hume in 1885. The history of the Indian National Congress became the history of the nationalist movement in India. The Congress during this period, that is in the first 20 years of its inception, did nothing in creating political awareness and a feeling of unity. This phase can be called an era of moderates in the nationalist movement. The formation of the Muslim League is considered to be the first fruit of the master strategy of divide and rule. The British were happy that they had succeeded in separating 62 million Muslims from the Hindus. Thus arose the evil monster of communalism in our country. The First World War broke out in 1914. The Congress decided to support the British. It was believed, especially by the moderates, that the British would be obliged to grant freedom to India after the war. But it was soon realized that this hope would never be fulfilled, as the war was being fought to retain colonies. Consequently, two Home Rule Leagues were set up during 1915-16. One was started by Bal Gangadhar Tilak at Pune and the other by Annie Besant at Chennai. These leagues aimed at the achievement of Swaraj or self-government. This gave the Indian nationalism a definite goal to achieve. The movement avoided violent or revolutionary methods. The Home Rule League worked as auxiliary units of the Congress. The period between 1905 and 1918 in our national movement is called the era of radicals. The radicals criticized the moderates on these grounds, that is, failure to define India's political goals using mild and ineffective methods and failure to make the movement a mass movement. The radicals believed in direct political action and in demanding Swaraj or self-rule instead of constitutional reforms. The radical faction was led by the trio popularly known as Lal Balpal, that is Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Bipin Chandra Pal. Bankim Chandra, Swami Vivekanand, Swami Dayanand, Saraswati and Aurobindo Ghosh inspired the radical philosophy by their ideas and preachings. Curzon's repressive policies in India, which culminated in the partition of Bengal on communal lines in order to divide and rule, became the immediate cause of agitation. There was an agitation against the partition of Bengal also. This means adoption of boycott of foreign goods and adoption of Swadeshi or indigenously produced goods. The boycott and Swadeshi soon spread and became countrywide movements. All sections of the society, including students and women, became active in this agitation. It became a mass movement. The British government used all kinds of violent repressive measures to suppress this. From 1919 to 1934, the Montague-Chelmsford reforms introduced diarchy in the provinces with the Government of India Act 1919. The moderates welcomed these reforms while the radicals rejected them. The Rowlatt Act was also passed in 1919 to suppress political violence. At this juncture appeared a new face in the political area of India's freedom movement. This was Mahatma Gandhi, who filled the vacuum created in the top leadership of the Congress. Gandhi had led the movement against discrimination meted out to Indians in South Africa. He had used a political weapon called satyagraha, that is, truth force or love force or soul force. His first triumph in India was the Champaran Satyagraha. This was the beginning of the third phase of the freedom struggle, which can be called the Gandhian era. A movement against the Rowlatt Act was launched, but Gandhi took it back because violence erupted. He was strictly against violence. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre took place in Amritsar on April 13, 1919. More than 1,000 people were massacred on the orders of General Dyer. The Khilafat movement started in November 1919. The aim was to pressurize the government to set right the wrongs done to the Muslims on the issue of Turkey. The Khilafat movement merged with the non-cooperation movement under Gandhi's leadership. He issued a manifesto on 10th March 1920, spelling out his philosophy of non-violent non-cooperation. He laid down an elaborate program of boycott of anything British, including jobs, courts, schools, colleges, functions and goods. A constructive program included promotion of Swadeshi, removal of untouchability and promotion of Hindu-Muslim unity. Chittaranjan Das and Motilal Nehru planned to break the system from within the councils under the banner of Swaraj Party, but it failed within 3 years. Thank you.